Hey guys, this is KJ and welcome to my first 2.2 tutorial. I'm going to be going over 3 different triggers and the new spawn remapping that has been added in the most recent update. Hopefully you find this useful. Let's get started. So I'm going to open up this empty level here and I'm going to go to my triggers tab, get the spawn trigger. It's this green one. It's been in the game for quite a while, long before 2.2, but recently it got updated, so I'm going to be going over how to use them. And with the introduction of platformer mode, which I'm going to set my level to right now, spawn triggers are more useful than ever, so we're going to be learning how to use them. So if you don't know what a spawn trigger does, it basically activates some other trigger. Pretty much any other trigger can be activated using a spawn trigger. So let's put down something like a move, a pulse, an alpha, a toggle, and basically anything. If I select these, then they all have this spawn trigger ability, and if you go into them individually, you'll see here there's the spawn trigger, there's a spawn trigger here, there's one at the bottom here, and for the move one, they're generally somewhere in the bottom corners. Different ones will have them in different places, but if you select multiple triggers at once, you'll be able to easily select spawn trigger. And you also have this one called multi-trigger, which just means that you can spawn this trigger more than once. So you'll see what that means. The spawn trigger itself looks like this. We have a group ID, we can add some delay, and spawn triggers themselves can also be touch triggered or spawn triggered. So let's create a little structure of some kind. I'll just make a spike that is going to move up and down like this. So it's going to hit the ground, and then maybe I want it to move back up, and it would have that sort of animation. So let's set something like that up. We'll put this group as group 1, these objects, so then we can make the object move. Let's get rid of these other triggers for now, because I'm not going to be using them for the time being. And we'll make this object move. Let's have it move 1, 2, 3, 4 down. So we're going to set this move Y to -40. Maybe give it a bounce. And if I make sure that spawn trigger is disabled for the time being, it's going to hit the ground and do that little bounce. So that's quite nice. Maybe I'll move it down a bit. I don't want it to move quite as far. Yeah, that should be alright. That's a nice little bounce. Now this move trigger is not touch triggered or spawn triggered, so it's going to activate automatically, as you can see. Even if I don't move, it just activates. This is dependent on how far away it is from the start line, so if I move it all the way over there, then it's going to take a lot longer to activate. But if I move it right up close to the start line or even behind it, it's just going to activate straight away. But maybe I don't want this to activate straight away. I want it to activate at a certain point. I can add this to a new group, so group 2 is our next one, and then I can use the spawn trigger to activate group 2. So what this means is that this spawn trigger is going to activate this move trigger. And remember, you need to make sure that the move trigger is set to spawn trigger, and if you want it to happen more than once, set it to multi-trigger. Now, if I set this spawn trigger to, say, touch triggered, just for this demonstration, this move trigger is not being called at all. But when I touch this spawn trigger, the spawn trigger will activate the move trigger and it will perform the action. And there we go. Now, it's not going to do it more than once, but if we set multi-trigger on this one, then we can activate it more than once. So every time we touch the spawn trigger, it's calling the move trigger, and you can't see it because it's below the ground now, but it did do it more than once. So obviously that's not super useful right now, because we could have simply just put this move trigger down, made that touch triggered, and performed the exact same action. But what spawn triggers are really useful for is calling multiple things at once. So if I also want to add another trigger, let's put maybe a pulse trigger, make group 1 pulse red, and we'll make it fade out after a certain time. Make sure that this is also spawn triggered and multi-trigger, and make sure that it's on the same group number 2. Now, this spawn trigger will call both of these at the exact same time. So that's much more useful, because we can see that happening. Having a single spawn trigger activate multiple other triggers is one of the good uses for spawn triggers, but an even more useful feature is spawn loops. Let's say I wanted to have this structure move down, but then after it bounces and hits the floor, I want it to move back up. So let's do something like that. Let's create another move trigger. So this time it will move positive 30, and maybe we'll give it some sort of easing. There we go. And for now, I'm going to get rid of this pulse trigger. I don't need it for this. So I'm going to take this off spawn trigger, and if we have a look at what that looks like, it will hit the ground and move back up. Let's set that up in a spawn loop. I'm going to delete this spawn trigger for now, and I'm going to use a new 2.2 feature where I select both of these move triggers. I'm actually going to delete the group on it as well. And then I'm going to pause the game, go to this button at the top called Create Loop. Now what that's going to do is it's going to automatically set up a spawn loop for you. So let's do that. And it's created these, and you can see it's doing the loop on its own. So this is super useful because now I have a loop where this block is going to move up and down forever. Now you might want to play around with the parameters for some of these things. If you go into here, you see that they have delays. They have some automatic delays set up in some of them. This one doesn't, this one does. Maybe I want to set this delay to much higher. I'll set them both to 1 for now and see how it looks. This plus or minus, by the way, is variance. So if I have this set to 1 and I wanted a variance of 0.5, that just means it can go 0.5 below or above my value of 1. So it'll pick a random number between 0.5 and 1.5 because that's 0.5 away from 1 in either direction. So you can add a bit of randomness to the time variation in certain circumstances. Now in this case I've actually got some weirdness going on because sometimes using the create loop feature doesn't work perfectly. So I am gonna go over how to manually set up a loop because it's not actually that difficult. I'm gonna annotate this with text, so if that helps you then definitely use this. But if it doesn't, then you don't need to use it. For now, I'm just going to put some text that says step 1 and step 2, just so I can very clearly see. I might scale that down. It doesn't need to be super big and sort of in your face. It's just going to be here as a visual indicator of what I'm doing. So at step 1, the block is going to move down, and at step 2, it's going to move back up. That's all that's happening, and I want to repeat step 1 and step 2 over and over again in that order. So we know that to activate a move trigger, let's make sure both of these are set to a spawn trigger and multi-trigger. They are. To activate this, we need to give this trigger a group. We'll make it group 2, and we'll make this one group 3. So they're 2 different groups. To activate one, group 2, and we'll leave that without any touch or spawn trigger. So this is going to automatically trigger group 1. There we go. Or rather, it's going to trigger step 1, which is under group 2. Then we can add another spawn trigger and give it group 2 and make it activate group 3. So what this is going to do is this spawn trigger is going to activate both the move trigger and this other spawn trigger. And that spawn trigger will then in turn activate this move trigger. So you can see how we've sort of got a step-by-step process happening here. But I probably don't want to have this spawn trigger activate instantly, so maybe I'll add a half a second delay, and that means this spawn trigger will activate this spawn trigger, but then this one will wait half a second before it activates this move trigger on step 2. To complete this loop, now all we need to do is add another one here that calls group 2, but is set to group 3. So this one will activate at the very beginning of the level, which will cause this one to happen. It will wait half a second, and then it will cause this step to happen. But then this one will wait half a second and go back to the beginning, and then we've got a loop between these two. And of course, after all of this, don't forget to make sure that both of these spawn triggers are themselves spawn triggered and multi-triggered. Everything that is part of your step system should be spawn triggered and multi-triggered. The only thing that shouldn't be is this one at the beginning, because this is the spawn trigger that's going to activate this entire sequence. So now we've got a block that moves up and down, and it does it all on its own, over and over again, forever. Because this spawn trigger is activating step 1, which activates step 2, which activates step 1, which activates step 2, and so on and so forth. So that's how we make a loop, and of course you can change the timings. Maybe I want a longer delay here, so it waits a bit longer before it goes down. That looks quite nice. And you can add as many steps as you want to this. So maybe I want a step 3 where I have something different happen. Let's make the object pulse again. So I'll make group number 1, and I'll give it a fade of some kind, and I'll make it on a new group. The only thing we need to change now is make our spawn for group 2 go back to this stage. It's going to be number 3 or number 4, and then this one's going to be number 3, but it's going to activate group 4. So this is group 2, this is group 3, and this is group 4. Make sure they all have those correct groupings. But this one's going to activate group 2, which is this, and that's going to activate group 3, and that's going to activate group 2, and that's going to activate group 3, and it's going to go step 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 in that loop. And I almost forgot, make sure that this pulse effect is, of course, spawn triggered and multi-triggered, because otherwise it's not going to work. You can just easily select all of them, of course, make sure they're all set to that. And then it's going to do it in order. It's going to move down, it's going to move up, it's going to flash, it's going to move down, up, flash, over and over again. So we've actually got 3 steps now, and you can easily just add more and more steps as long as you make sure that the loop from one step to the next and back is all set up properly. The next trigger I want to look at is the event trigger, which can be used in a similar way to the spawn trigger, but it can be used to make some really cool things, not just in platformer mode, but it is particularly useful in platformer mode. So let's have a look. If I go to edit object, we can see the group ID. There's some extra IDs which I'm not going to play around with, but really it's just a very simple looking interface here. If I click this button in the top right here, it will give us a list of all of the events. Now there are quite a lot, there are 75 total. For some reason 64 is on this final page rather than being between 63 and 65, but yeah, there's a lot of things here. I'm just gonna pick one. Let's go for this orb activated one. This just means every time the player activates an orb, doesn't matter which type of orb, it could be a yellow orb, a blue orb, a dash orb, we're going to have something happen. You can select more specific things, like here we have specific types of pads or specific orbs. Here there's like the green orb, the gravity orb is the blue one, there's yellow and pink orbs here. There are specific portals that when you enter them you can have events happen, but for now I'm just going to pick the orb activated. You can have more than one thing activated. I'm just going to go for this one. So if I want to have, say, a sound effect play whenever I hit an orb, let's put down a sound effect trigger and find something useful. So let's pick maybe a jump sound. That one sounds good, we'll use that. So every time I touch an orb, or every time specifically I interact with an orb, I want this sound effect to play. So if I make this sound effect trigger spawn and multi-triggered, and give it a group, so the next one is 5 that I have available. Let's make group 5. Now this event trigger will activate group 5 whenever this event occurs. So whenever the orb is activated, it will call upon group 5. Group 5 is this sound effect trigger, which is spawn triggered. It can be triggered multiple times. Let's have a look at how this works. Every time I interact with this orb, we get our sound effect. And if I don't interact with the orb, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen with regular jumps, but every time I interact with the orb itself, we get that sound effect. So that's a super easy way to add some extra details into your levels. Now, of course, it doesn't have to just be sound effects. You could make something move every time you hit an orb. You could make something pulse. You could have a cool pulse effect. Let's add a pulse effect real quick now. Have it maybe pulse the background. If we make the background sort of pulse bright, make sure that's on the same group. It is indeed spawn triggered and multi-triggered. So let's have a look and see how that looks. There you go. So it plays our sound effect and it pulses the background every time we hit an orb. But of course, you can have this set up for multiple things. You can have a different event trigger which has a different thing. So maybe you want something else to happen for a pad, change the group, have that affect something different. You can have multiple event triggers doing different things. Very useful for just setting up things like sound effects or any sort of other effects for when the player does certain things. The last trigger I want to look at is another new one, which is the sequence trigger. So it's this one. It has a little 1, 2, 3 icon inside it. The sequence trigger is, again, similar to spawn trigger, but it can call things in a sequence. So I'm going to get rid of these orbs as well. I don't need them. We're going to go back to this moving spike as our little sequence test. So let's have a look at how this works. I'm actually going to remove these spawn triggers for the time being. I'm going to disable them just by enabling them all as touch triggered. So I'm going to move them out the way. These won't affect anything that we're doing now, of course, because they're touch triggered and they're just out the way. So this event is not going to happen. This whole spawn loop, I should say, that's not going to happen now. But we're still going to have our step-by-step sequence. We're going to have it move down, move up, and then pulse. So let's make sure we know what groups we're dealing with. Number 2, number 3, and number 4. So if I go into this sequence trigger, edit the object, have a look in our group ID, we want to activate 2, and then 3, and then 4. And I'm going to leave the count on 1. That just means each of those triggers will be called once. So what this means is that every time this sequence trigger is activated, it's going to activate one of these, but in order of our steps. So let's make this touch triggered, and it's multi-triggered by default. Every time I collide with this sequence trigger, it's going to perform one of those steps, but in the right order. So first it moves down, then it'll move back up, and then it'll pulse. And after that, it stops doing anything. So if you want it to continue, you want to change the mode. At the moment, it's on a mode stop. If you want it to loop, then we can click that, and now it will go down, go up, pulse, go down, go up, pulse, and it will just loop the sequence forever. It's doing our step 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3 over and over again. If you want to click mode last, what that's going to do is it's just going to repeat the final step of the sequence over and over. So first it moves down, then it moves up, then it pulses, and then it's going to repeat that final step over and over from this point onwards. So now it only does that final pulse. I'm going to leave it on mode loop, and I'm also going to mess around with this slider. This is a minimum value that gives a sort of delay as to when the sequence can be called. So you'll see what I mean. Let's put it all the way up to 1 second for now. That'll be enough. This means that even if I jump quickly, it won't call these instantly. So you see I jumped into that sequence trigger 3 times, but it didn't call step 2. And that's because a second hadn't passed yet. It waits an entire second before allowing the next step of the sequence to call. So now I've waited well over a second, now it'll do that. And if I wait over a second again, it'll do the pulse, but it won't do that if I don't wait a second. It'll only allow the sequence to happen after a second is called. And you can type in and make it bigger if you want. You can make it 10 seconds. So now, even after I wait a little while, oh, it's not doing anything. But after 10 whole seconds are up, it will finally then allow step 2 to be called. And then it will wait 10 seconds again before it allows step 3 to be called. So if you want some sort of delay like that, you can do that. I'm going to turn it back down, and now I'm going to look at the reset. So reset just means after a certain amount of time has elapsed, it will reset the sequence. Let's put it up to 1. At the moment, it's set to reset full, which just means that it will reset after I wait a second. It will reset back to the beginning. And because I've waited a second, it's not doing the pulse. And if I wait over a second again, it goes back to step 1. If you do reset step, that just means that if you're on step 3, then after a second, if you haven't completed that step, it will go back to step 2, and then after another second, it will go back to step 1. If you don't want any sort of reset to happen, then just leave that at 0. Generally, you probably won't need it, but it's useful to know that it exists. So if you want things to happen in a certain order, you can use the sequence event. It can be useful for certain things such as boss battles, or something that might have multiple phases and you want to sort of activate things in a specific order. So yeah, I'm sure you can find some good uses for it. But yeah, that's how you use it. The final thing I'm gonna go over is spawn loops. So I'm gonna get rid of the sequence trigger. I'm not gonna use that. I'm gonna bring these things back, make sure they're spawn triggered and multi-triggered. Of course, the first one should not be spawn triggered. Let's move them back down. So there we go. I have my spawn loop. And to simplify things, I'm gonna only do 2 steps. So let's just get rid of these things that I don't need. This is going to be group 3, so we just have our group 2 and group 3 spawn happening over and over. So let's have a look. Yep, we have our movement up and down, and that's it. So what if I wanted to have another one of these, and I wanted to have them in a row? So I want to have maybe a load of these, and for this one moves down, and then this one moves down, and then this one moves down, in a sort of a wave pattern. Well, we could easily do that. If I just copy this and I copy the spawn triggers, well, I can copy paste them, use the build helper button, and it's going to automatically assign new groups to all of these things. So now I have 2 things that happen. Right now they happen at the exact same time, but if I wanted to delay it by, say, moving the spawn trigger along a bit, well, there we go. That works. You can also achieve this by having them at the exact same time, but adding a delay here. So maybe I want 0.5 delay between them. There we go. Now this all works fine, but it's a bit clunky. There's too many objects here. We don't need this many. Now I love Build Helper. Build Helper is one of the most useful features in the game, but we don't need it for something like this, something this simple at least, because we can use the new spawn remapping. So let's have a look at the second page of the spawn group. This looks similar to the sequence trigger. It has 2 values, but of course instead they are slightly different. We have an original ID and a new ID, and we can put some values in here, add it in, and we can have whatever values we want. We can take them away if we don't like what we've added. But this is the interface that we're going to be using. So rather than doing a build helper, I'm just going to copy this and add it to a new group. Let's add group 4. Let's do a few of them. I'll make one for group 5, and I'll make another one, group 6. That'll do for now. We've got 4 different structures that will all be moving in some form. So now, if I go to my spawn group, what I want to do is I want to apply the movement of group 1, because that is this group. I want to apply that movement to group 4. So if I apply the original ID of 1 to group 4, you'll see it now is actually moving group 4. Now the problem is it stopped moving group 1, and I don't know if that's a bit of an oversight on my part. Maybe I'm missing something, but if I added another one that was 1 and 5, it would now only affect 5. So what I find is really the easiest way to do it is to just copy the spawn trigger and then apply the change. And so now maybe I want to add a delay, 0.3 delay. It's gonna then remap this movement onto this one, and it's gonna have a delay of 0.3 as well. So that's really useful. I can then copy that again, change this to group 5. Group 1 is going to be applied to group 5. I'm going to add another 0.3 seconds delay, and then I'm going to do a final change of making and add another 0.3 seconds of delay. So now we have the same sort of setup where I have more than one of these things, but I don't need this step 1 and step 2 grouping all applied. All I need is just 3 extra triggers. Rather than having 5 triggers for a single object and then 5 triggers for another object and 5 for another, I just have 5 triggers for the first and then 1 trigger per other object. So that saves a lot of objects, and it also saves a lot of groups because you don't need to have these spawn triggers in new groups. So that's super useful. Now I have this setup where all of these are moving in the same fashion but at a delay, and all I've needed is 3 extra triggers. So yeah, that's spawn remapping. It's a really useful feature if you want to have some sort of setup like this. Basically anything where there are multiple objects that are moving, or not even specifically moving, just they have some same thing being applied to them, whether that's an opacity change or a pulse or whatever it is. So hopefully that was all useful. I hope I explained it clearly enough. I know there's a lot of confusing things going on with these triggers, but just play around with them, get used to them. Do use that the create loop function if you find it useful. I know sometimes it might be a bit messy, but yeah, just learn how to use the spawn triggers and you'll be able to create some awesome things with platformer mode. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. If this tutorial helped you out, then please consider subscribing. I also stream on Twitch, so I'd be really thankful if you went and checked that out. But yeah, with all that said, thanks for watching this, and I hope you enjoyed.